Welcome back. Today we're investigating a case that redefined the very nature of human depravity. Milwaukee, July 1991. The hallway of Oxford Apartments reeked of a vicious murder that had been years in the making. Inside Unit 213, a mundane refrigerator hummed in the dark. On the top shelf beside a jar of mustard sat a plastic container. But inside wasn't food. It was a fresh human heart. The resident, Jeffrey Dahmer, was a quiet, polite man. Yet he harbored an insatiable desire that turned this home into a museum of horrors. How did this happen? To understand the horror of Apartment 213, we must look at the actual blueprint of a broken mind. There is a common saying in criminology: nature loads the gun while environment pulls the trigger. For Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, the loading of that gun began in the quiet, mundane suburbs of Milwaukee, long before he ever touched a human life. In 1964, a 4-year-old Jeffrey underwent a routine surgery for a double hernia. To a doctor, it was a success. To his family, it was the day the lights went out in his eyes. Before the surgery, he was a bubbly, energetic toddler. Afterward, he became a ghost in the house. He didn't cry, he didn't play. He simply sat in corners, staring at walls. This wasn't an abstract psychological shift. It was a visible, physical withdrawal from the world. While Jeffrey was turning inward, his home life was exploding outward. His father, Lionel Dahmer, was a research chemist who was almost never home, buried in his work and his own thoughts. When he was home, he was often arguing with Jeffrey's mother, Joyce. She wasn't just unhappy. She was a woman drowning in severe depression and a heavy daily cocktail of prescription pills. The house didn't smell like home-cooked meals. It smelled of medicine and tension. Young Jeffrey watched from the stairs as his parents fought, effectively becoming an invisible observer in his own life. There was no one to hold him, no one to talk to him, and no one to notice that the silence inside him was growing dangerous. By the time the family moved to a new house in Ohio, the foundation of his empathy had already crumbled. He wasn't learning how to love people. He was learning how to watch them from a distance, like specimens under glass. As Jeffrey grew into a teenager, his interest moved from the silent house to the silent woods. This is where the nature of his crimes took a physical form. He began patrolling the roads near his home, but he wasn't looking for friends. He was looking for roadkill. He would bring back dead squirrels, raccoons, and birds to a small wooden shack in the backyard. In a strange and tragic attempt to bond with his son, Lionel actually taught Jeffrey how to use chemicals to bleach and preserve animal bones. He thought his son was interested in science, but Jeffrey was interested in the power. He spent hours in that shack, his hands covered in chemicals, dissolving the flesh of animals to reach the clean, white skeleton underneath. On one occasion, he even took a dog's head and impaled it on a wooden stake behind his house, a brutal, concrete image of the violence brewing in his mind. By the age of 14, Jeffrey began to realize two things. He was gay, and his sexual fantasies were terrifyingly different from everyone else's. He didn't fantasize about dates or conversation. He fantasized about a motionless, unconscious partner, someone who could never leave him or reject him. To numb the fear of these thoughts, he started drinking heavily, often bringing a thermos of liquor to his high school classes. This was the dead zone. He was a young man walking the hallways, smelling of alcohol and rot, completely disconnected from the living world. He didn't see people as humans anymore. He saw them as collections of bones and parts, just like the animals in his shack. The gun was now fully loaded, and in 1978, when his parents finally divorced and left him entirely alone in their house, the silence was finally broken by a knock at the door. The year was 1978. While the rest of America was basking in the heat of a June summer, a dark transformation was completing itself in a quiet, secluded house in Bath, Ohio. Jeffrey Dahmer was 18 years old, newly graduated, and for the first time in his life, he was entirely alone. His parents had finalized their bitter divorce, leaving him in an empty house that echoed with the ghosts of their arguments. On June 18th, he saw a young hitchhiker on the side of the road. Stephen Hicks was 19, vibrant and looking for a ride to a concert. To anyone else, he was just a traveler. To Dahmer, He was the answer to a crushing, unbearable loneliness. He invited Hicks back to his house for a beer. For a few hours, the empty house felt alive. But when Hicks stood up to leave, the unrelenting compulsion for control, the fear of being abandoned once again, snapped. Dahmer didn't want to hurt him. He simply didn't want him to walk out that door. He struck Stephen Hicks in the back of the head with a 10-pound barbell. The silence that followed was unlike anything Jeffrey had experienced before. It wasn't the silence of an empty home. It was the cold, heavy silence of an irretrievable sin. In the days that followed, the polite chocolate factory worker of the future was born in the basement of that Ohio home. He didn't just hide the body, he dismantled it. He used his father's chemicals to dissolve the flesh and a sledgehammer to grind the bones into dust, scattering them in the woods behind the house. He had committed the ultimate act of possession, but instead of satisfaction, he was met with a terrifying realization. The hunger wasn't gone, it was merely fed. What followed this first blood was a period of nearly 10 years, a decade of silence that many find the most baffling part of the Dahmer story. Criminologists call this a cooling-off period, but for Jeffrey, it was more like a slow, agonizing rot. This was the empty chair era of his life. He tried to be a normal man. He enrolled at Ohio State University, but failed within months, drowning his thoughts in cheap liquor. His father, desperate to fix him, pushed him into the United States Army. Dahmer was sent to West Germany as a combat medic. Think about the irony. A man with a dead zone in his soul, trained to save lives. But the military didn't cure the monster. It only provided a new cage. He was eventually discharged for his chronic alcoholism, a habit he used to numb the voices and the fantasies that never truly left him. By 1981, he was back in the States, eventually moving in with his grandmother, yours Catherine Dahmer, in West Allis, Wisconsin. To the neighbors, he was the perfect, shy, polite grandson. He went to church with her. He helped with the chores. He worked a mundane job at the Milwaukee Blood Center and later the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. But inside that house, the empty chair was still there, screaming for a companion. Jeffrey would spend his nights at local bars and bathhouses, not looking for a boyfriend, but searching for a thing. He began drugging men's drinks, experimenting with the power of unconsciousness. He wanted someone who could never say no, someone who could never leave him, someone who would sit in that empty chair and never get up. For 9 years, he lived on the edge of a total psychological collapse, a ticking time bomb disguised as a boring, blue-collar worker. The vicious murder of 1978 was no longer a haunting memory. It was becoming a blueprint. The rot of isolation had finally eaten through his last remaining bit of humanity. By 1987, the decade of silence was about to end. The monster had finished hibernating, and this time, the quiet grandson wouldn't stop until he had built a museum of horrors that the world would never forget. By 1981, the world believed Jeffrey Dahmer was finally on the right path. After the chaos of his teenage years and his failure in the military, he moved into a small, quiet house in West Allis, Wisconsin. This was the home of his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer. For the next 8 years, this suburban residence would become the stage for one of the most disturbing psychological struggles in criminal history. It was a place of polished furniture, church-going Sundays, and a basement that was slowly becoming a sanctuary for the dead. To the neighbors on 92nd Street, Jeffrey was the ideal grandson. He was shy, he was polite, and he was gainfully employed, first at the Milwaukee Blood Center and later at the Ambrosia Chocolate Factory. He was a face in the crowd, a quiet man who kept his lawn mowed and his head down. But behind this facade of normalcy, the insatiable desire was reaching a breaking point. Many people labeled Dahmer a psychopath, but a closer look at his time in West Allis suggests something different. He wasn't a cold, calculating mastermind. He was a high-functioning sociopath, drowning in anxiety and a crushing sense of inadequacy. Unlike a psychopath who feels nothing, Jeffrey felt everything: the loneliness, the shame, and the desperate, twisted need for a companion who would never leave him. He didn't want to cause pain. He wanted to stop his own. But to stop his own pain, he was prepared to commit a series of vicious murders. The 9-year hibernation finally ended in September 1987. Jeffrey met a young man named Stephen Twomey at a local bar and took him to the Ambassador Hotel. What happened next is a chilling example of his lack of control. Jeffrey later claimed he had no memory of the actual killing. He woke up the next morning to find Twomey's lifeless body beside him. He hadn't planned a murder. He had spiraled into one. In a panic, he bought a large suitcase, packed the victim inside, and took a taxi back to his grandmother's house. Think about the sheer audacity of that moment. He carried a corpse past his grandmother, down the creaking wooden stairs and into the basement. This was the beginning of the acetone and lies era. As the weeks passed, a foul, cloying scent began to permeate the house. It wasn't the smell of a normal home. It was the heavy, sweet rot of decomposing tissue. Catherine was no fool. She noticed the odor. She noticed her grandson spending hours in the basement with the door locked. This is where the suspense of their daily life becomes almost unbearable. "Jeffrey, what is that terrible smell?" she would ask. His response was always a variation of the same lie. "It's just my taxidermy chemicals, Grandma." Or, "A raccoon must have crawled under the porch and died." He used industrial-strength acetone and bleach to scrub the floors, trying to drown out the reality of what lay beneath their feet. He was living a double life that was physically rotting the foundation of the only person who ever truly loved him. In 1989, the escalation continued with Orage Anthony Sears. This case was a dark milestone. After the murder, Jeffrey didn't just dispose of the body in the woods. He kept the head. He kept the bones. He was no longer just a killer. He was a collector. He was building his sanctuary, a private world where he held absolute power over his companions. But the basement was getting crowded. The smells were becoming harder to hide, and Catherine's suspicions were turning into genuine distress. The shy, polite man was running out of space and running out of excuses. He had spent 8 years trying to be normal, attending church and holding down jobs. But the gravity of his urges was too strong. The basement sanctuary had become a prison for both his victims and his own sanity. By May 1990, the tension reached a boiling point. Jeffrey was asked to leave his grandmother's house. He packed his belongings, his chemicals, and his trophies into a few boxes and moved into a low-income housing complex called the Oxford Apartments. He was moving into apartment 213. He was finally free from the eyes of his grandmother, and the world was about to witness a level of depravity that no one, not the police, not his family, and certainly not the victims, could have ever imagined. In May 1990, the quiet grandson finally moved out of his grandmother's basement and into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments. To the world, this was a fresh start for a shy, blue-collar worker. In reality, it was the beginning of a micro-disaster that would turn a small one-bedroom unit into a literal factory of death. The crimes committed inside apartment 213 were no longer just the result of a macabre obsession or a sudden snap. They were the implementation of a terrifying, logical goal. And Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just a killer. He had become a deranged architect of human submission. His goal was the creation of a perfect companion, someone who could never leave, never argue, and never reject him. This led to his most depraved phase, the zombie experiments. We must understand the insatiable desire for control that fueled these acts. To Jeffrey, the living were unpredictable and dangerous. Only the unconscious, the motionless, were safe. This wasn't about the thrill of pain. It was about the security of possession. In early 1991, Jeffrey met a vibrant 19-year-old named Errol Lindsay. Jeffrey lured him back to the apartment, drugged him, and then performed a procedure that defied human morality. Using his father's chemical background as a twisted blueprint, he used a power drill to create a small hole in Errol's skull. He then injected muriatic acid directly into the living brain tissue. Think about the chillingly objective nature of this scene. This was a scientific approach taken to a hellish extreme. Jeffrey wasn't looking for a corpse. He was looking for a thing. He wanted Errol to survive, but only as a shell, a human being with no will, a zombie who would exist only to serve his presence. When the experiment failed and Errol died, Jeffrey didn't feel remorse for the life lost. He felt frustration at the technical failure. To humanize the victims is to realize that Errol Lindsay was a brother, a son, and a person with a future, reduced to a specimen in a failed experiment. This brings us to the most painful, bright spot of systemic failure in the entire case: the tragedy of what curated synthesamphone. On May 27, 1991, Jeffrey performed the same horrific procedure on the 14-year-old boy. While Jeffrey went to buy more liquor, the zombie managed to crawl out of the apartment. Neighbors found him in the street, naked, bleeding from the head, and completely incoherent. When the police arrived, the twist occurred. Because of the authoritative and polite mask Jeffrey Dahmer wore, he was able to convince the officers that this child was his 19-year-old boyfriend. He claimed they were having a domestic dispute. Despite the frantic pleas of the local community, the police actually helped Jeffrey carry the dying boy back into the apartment. The moment that door clicked shut, the fate of curated synthesamphone was sealed. He was killed within the hour. This wasn't just a failure of one man. It was a failure of the entire system to see the monster standing right in front of them, hiding behind a shy smile and a white-collar facade. As the death toll in apartment 213 rose, the apartment itself began to transform. It was no longer a living space, it was becoming a temple. Jeffrey was now living in a dead zone, surrounded by the remains of 12 men. The air was a thick, cloying mixture of industrial chemicals and the gruesome stories of those he had dismantled. But for Jeffrey, this wasn't chaos. It was an organized sanctuary. He began the construction of his altar of bone. This was the ultimate expression of his possessive love. He didn't want to just kill, he wanted to curate. He collected the skulls of his victims, bleaching them white with the same chemicals his father had once shown him. He planned to build a shrine, a place of meditation where he could sit among the skeletons of his friends and feel a sense of absolute power. This altar was intended to be a place where he could finally belong, a sanctuary built from the vicious murder of others. But the possession went even deeper than bone. This is the dark philosophical inquiry at the heart of the Dahmer case, the act of the cannibal's communion. Jeffrey began to consume the hearts, bicep muscles, and internal organs of his victims. To the world, this is an act of pure horror. To Jeffrey, it was an act of becoming one. He believed that by eating them, they would literally become a permanent part of his body. They could never leave him if they were inside him. This is the insatiable desire pushed to its absolute limit. He wasn't looking for a meal. He was looking for a soul. He wanted to absorb their essence to fill the dead zone inside his own chest. Imagine the contrast of his daily life. By day, he was the polite worker at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, surrounded by the sweet smell of cocoa. By night, he was back in apartment 213, opening his refrigerator. Here is the punchline of his depravity. A visitor looking for a snack would have found a jar of mustard, a carton of milk, and a human head staring back at them from the bottom shelf. The shy neighbor was living a life that was a micro-disaster of the human soul. He had replaced all human connection with a collection of parts. He didn't have friends. He had a freezer full of memories. He didn't have a life. He had a shrine to death. The psychology here is a micro-disaster. Every victim was a world destroyed. Every act of cannibalism was a desperate attempt to fix a broken man who didn't know how to exist among the living. He had turned himself into a black hole, consuming everything around him in a failed attempt to feel whole. The polite face was now just a thin veil over a dead zone that was rapidly expanding. By the summer of 1991, the smells were so bad that neighbors were complaining. The blue barrel in his bedroom was full of acid and remains, and Jeffrey himself was lost in a fog of alcohol and bone. The Museum of Horrors was complete, and the curator was about to make one final, fatal mistake. May 27, 1991, remains one of the darkest stains on the history of modern law enforcement. It was a night when the system didn't just fail, it actively participated in a tragedy. On the pavement outside the Oxford apartments, a young boy lay shivering and incoherent. He was only 14 years old. Konarak Synthosamphone. He was naked, bleeding from a hole in his skull, and his eyes were glazed with the chemical fog of a failed experiment. 3 neighbors, including Annie Glenda Cleveland, had found him and called for help. They were looking at a child in desperate need of medical attention. But then, the resident of apartment 213 appeared. Jeffrey Dahmer did not flee. He didn't hide. Instead, he relied on the polite, shy persona he had cultivated for a decade. When officers John Balkerzak and Jens Joseph Gabrish arrived, they were met with 2 very different versions of reality. On one side were the frantic, concerned black women who saw a child in danger. On the other was the calm, white man who spoke with an authoritative, soft-spoken tone. Dahmer told the officers it was nothing more than a lover's quarrel. He lied and said the boy was his 19-year-old partner who had simply drunk too much. What happened next is a masterclass in institutional incompetence and systemic blindness. The officers didn't check for ID. They didn't wonder why a 19-year-old was naked and bleeding from the head. Instead, they dismissed the neighbors' concerns as meddling. They actually threatened to arrest the women if they didn't stop shouting. In a move that defies all logic, the police helped Dahmer carry the semi-conscious child back into his apartment, the very room where the vicious murder of others had already taken place. As they walked back to their squad car, the officers were recorded on police dispatch tapes laughing. They made homophobic jokes about needing to delouse themselves after being in the apartment. They were so blinded by their own prejudices and the polite facade of the suspect that they missed the smell of death and the sight of a victim. Within 30 minutes of the police leaving, Konarak Synthosamphone was dead. Jeffrey Dahmer would later admit that he couldn't believe his luck. He had been handed his victim back by the law itself. This remains the ultimate gut punch of the case. It exposes how racism and homophobia can turn the police into an unwitting accomplice to a monster. The boy who had managed the impossible, escaping the Museum of Horrors, was escorted back into the darkness by the people who were sworn to protect him. The tragedy of Konarak wasn't just a crime committed by one man, it was a crime committed by a society that chose to look away. On the stifling night of July 22, 1991, the clock finally ran out for the Milwaukee Cannibal. Tracy Edwards had been lured to apartment 213 with the promise of easy cash for a photo shoot. But the moment the door clicked shut, the mask of the shy neighbor slipped. Edwards found himself handcuffed and held at knife point, forced to listen to the rhythmic, low chanting of a man who had completely lost touch with reality. The air was heavy, saturated with the smell of industrial chemicals and a cloying, organic rot that Edwards couldn't identify. Not yet. In a frantic moment of truth, realizing his life hung by a thread, Edwards punched Dahmer and sprinted into the humid Milwaukee night. He flagged down a patrol car, a single handcuff still glinting on his wrist like a badge of survival. When the police returned to Unit 213, Jeffrey Dahmer remained eerily composed. He was the same polite, soft-spoken man the police had met months earlier during the Konarak incident. But this time, they didn't look away. Officer Rolf Mueller began a search of the bedroom and pulled open a drawer. Inside, he found a stack of Polaroid photographs. These weren't memories. They were a gruesome catalog of unthinkable depravity, graphic, posed images of dismantled bodies that no human eye was ever meant to see. "These are real," Mueller whispered to his partner. In that instant, the castle of horrors was breached. The curator of this museum of death was led away in chains, transitioning from his private sanctuary into the cold, sterile light of an interrogation room. He had lived among the dead for over a decade, slipping through every systemic crack. If Tracy Edwards hadn't fought back, the museum would have surely grown. The collapse was total. But as the investigators stepped deeper into the apartment, they realized the world was about to hear the most gruesome stories in forensic history. The trial of Jeffrey Dahmer was a battle of definitions. Was he sane or insane? After 60 hours of chilling confessions, the jury reached a verdict. He was legally sane. He was sentenced to 15 life terms, nearly 1,000 years behind bars. But justice arrived elsewhere. In 1994, a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, ended the curator's life with a metal bar in a prison bathroom. We are left with the haunting truth. Nature loads the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. While the monster is dead, the vicious murder spree leaves a permanent scar on the families of the 17 men he dismantled. The Museum of Horrors is finally closed, but one question lingers. Was he born this way, or did we let him become this? Thank you for joining us on this investigation. If you found this case as chilling as we did, please leave a comment below. Until next time.